While the world celebrated the Armistice of November 11, 1918, American soldiers found themselves fighting and dying in a forgotten war thousands of miles from the Western Front. In the frozen wilderness of North Russia, the 339th Infantry Regiment, Detroit's own, battled not Germans but Bolsheviks in temperatures that plunged to 40 below zero. This is the story of the polar bears, American doughboys who continued to fight for democracy in one of history's most controversial and misunderstood military interventions. The road to intervention. As American troops poured into France in 1917 to reinforce exhausted Allied armies, Russia's Eastern Front was collapsing. The Bolshevik Revolution had toppled the Tsarist government, and Lenin's new regime sought peace with Germany at any cost. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed in March 1918, removed Russia from the war and freed dozens of German divisions for service in France. More immediately concerning to the Allies were the massive stockpiles of military supplies, rifles, ammunition, artillery, and equipment worth millions sitting in Russian ports at Murmansk, Archangel, and Vladivostok. President Woodrow Wilson faced intense pressure from Britain and France to intervene militarily in Russia. The stated goals were to secure the war supplies, support anti-Bolshevik forces, and potentially reopen the Eastern Front. Wilson, deeply reluctant to involve America in Russia's civil war, finally agreed to a limited intervention. His aide memoir of July 17, 1918, explicitly restricted American involvement to guarding supplies and avoiding combat operations. Secretary of War Newton Baker's warning to Major General William Graves, who would command the Siberian expedition, proved prophetic. Watch your step. You will be walking on eggs loaded with dynamite. Ironically, Colonel George Stewart, commanding the North Russia expedition, never received Wilson's restrictions and would lead his men directly into combat from the moment they landed. From Michigan to Murmansk, the selection of troops for the Russian intervention reflected the hasty, almost haphazard nature of the operation. The 85th Division had just arrived in England, expecting deployment to France, when General Pershing received orders to detach units for Russia. The 339th Infantry Regiment, drawn largely from Detroit and Michigan, along with the 310th Engineers, 337th Field Hospital, and 337th Ambulance Company, suddenly found themselves re-equipped with foreign weapons and Arctic gear. The transformation was jarring. American Springfield rifles were exchanged for Russian Mosin Nagant rifles, ironically manufactured in America for the Tsar, but never delivered. British cold weather gear replaced American uniforms, fur caps, leather jerkins, and the infamous Shackleton boots that would prove dangerously inadequate on ice. The hasty rearmament reflected broader logistical failures that would plague the expedition. On August 27, 1918, the convoy departed England for Archangel. During the voyage, Spanish influenza struck with devastating effect. 72 American soldiers died before ever seeing Russia, their bodies committed to the cold waters of the Arctic Ocean. It was an ominous beginning to an ill-fated expedition into the White Hell Archangel in September 1918 presented a scene of chaos. The port city, controlled by anti-Bolshevik forces and British troops, served as the expedition's base. Colonel Stewart, believing his orders were to support British operations, immediately complied when British commanders ordered the 339th Infantry to the front. Within days of landing, American troops found themselves scattered across a 500-mile front, split between Force A and Force C, fighting a war they barely understood. The first American casualties came quickly. On September 16th, at the village of Seltzow, 3 soldiers died in a skirmish with Bolshevik forces. First Lieutenant Albert Smith earned the expedition's first Distinguished Service Cross, leading his platoon against fortified positions. By month's end, with winter already setting in, American forces had suffered 69 dead and 150 wounded. The conditions defied comprehension. American soldiers, accustomed to the trenches of France, found themselves garrisoning isolated villages connected only by frozen rivers and primitive trails. They subsisted on British rations, bully beef, hardtack, and tea, while temperatures plummeted and daylight dwindled to a few hours. The Shackleton boots, designed for Antarctic exploration, proved disastrous for combat, lacking traction on ice and offering little protection against the cold. The Battle of Armistice Day, the war's cruelest irony, occurred on November 11, 1918. While the Western Front fell silent, Company B of the 339th Infantry fought for its life at Tulgas, 200 miles southeast of Archangel. In pre-dawn darkness, as celebrations erupted across Europe, 2,500 Bolshevik troops, supported by gunboats and artillery, attacked the village. Captain Robert Boyd commanded a mixed force of 650 men, Americans, British Royal Scots, Canadian artillerymen, and White Russians. The Bolsheviks quickly overran Lower Tulgas and captured the Allied hospital. Lieutenant Harry Dennis's platoon in Upper Tulgas fought desperately before being driven back. For 4 days, the battle raged with an intensity that matched anything on the Western Front. On November 14th, with ammunition running low and positions crumbling, Boyd authorized a desperate counterattack. Lieutenant John Cudahy led an American platoon through knee-deep snow in a surprise assault that broke the Bolshevik offensive. The battle cost 7 Americans killed and 23 wounded, while Bolshevik losses exceeded 500 dead. News of the armistice reached the exhausted defenders days later. The realization that the war had ended everywhere except Russia devastated morale. One soldier wrote home, "Everyone else is celebrating peace while we're still getting shot at by people we don't understand for reasons nobody can explain." Winter War. As the Russian winter deepened, the nature of combat changed. The Bolsheviks, now organized as the Red Army under Leon Trotsky, fielded 42,000 troops in the region with superior artillery. The Allies, stretched thin across impossible distances, adopted a defensive strategy, while the 310th Engineers frantically constructed blockhouses and fortifications. The Battle of Shenkursk in January 1919 demonstrated the expedition's precarious position. This vital town on the Vega River, 300 miles from Archangel, anchored the Allied southern defenses. Captain Otto Odjard's Company A held the forward village of Nizhny Gora, while Captain James Fitzsimon's Company C garrisoned Shenkursk itself. On January 19th, the Bolsheviks attacked with overwhelming force. Lieutenant Harry Meade's platoon at Nizhny Gora faced 1,000 attackers supported by artillery. In a fighting withdrawal through waist-deep snow, only Meade and 6 men of his 47-man platoon reached safety. For days, the Americans held Vysokaya Gora against repeated assaults. During one bombardment, Lieutenant Ralph Powers, a medical officer with the 337th Ambulance Company, was mortally wounded while evacuating casualties. Despite his wounds, Powers ensured all wounded were loaded onto sleds before dying, earning a posthumous Distinguished Service Cross. The retreat from Shenkursk became an epic of endurance. On January 24th, with Bolsheviks closing in, Colonel Graham ordered evacuation. In darkness and sub-zero temperatures, the column of soldiers, civilians, and wounded began a 40-mile trek to safety. Men discarded their useless Shackleton boots, preferring frostbite to falling on ice. The medical personnel of the 337th Ambulance Company performed heroically, keeping wounded men alive through the hellish march. After 3 days, the column reached Vystavka, having lost 27 Americans killed and 30 missing. The bayonet decides, spring 1919, brought no relief. The Battle of Bolshy Ozerki in late March saw some of the expedition's fiercest fighting. American engineers and infantry joined British and White Russian forces, attempting to recapture this strategic railroad junction. The assault failed against 7,000 entrenched Bolsheviks. The battle's most poignant moment came when Lieutenant Clifford Phillips led his machine gun teams forward to cover a British withdrawal. Severely wounded, Phillips refused evacuation, telling Captain Richard Ballensinger, "My God, I got it. Captain, don't bother with me. I'm done for. Just look after the boys." Phillips died on May 10th, adding another posthumous Distinguished Service Cross to the expedition's growing list. Throughout these battles, the 310th Engineers performed magnificently, constructing 483 blockhouses, 151 barracks, and 273 machine gun emplacements under combat conditions. The 337th Field Hospital battled not only combat casualties, but a devastating influenza epidemic. Their dedication resulted in remarkably high survival rates despite primitive conditions. The long journey home. On February 22, 1919, wireless operators in Archangel received electrifying news. President Wilson had authorized the withdrawal of American troops at the earliest possible time. But earliest possible meant waiting for the spring thaw to open Archangel's frozen harbor. Brigadier General Wilds Richardson arrived in April to oversee the withdrawal, finding American troops exhausted but still fighting. Through May, units gradually transferred their positions to White Russian forces. On Memorial Day 1918, the assembled Americans in Archangel participated in a parade, receiving decorations including 23 Distinguished Service Crosses. The departure began June 3rd. Wearing newly issued polar bear shoulder patches, the soldiers of the 339th Infantry boarded transports for home. They stopped briefly in France, where 119 American bodies were reinterred in military cemeteries. On July 4, 1919, Detroit welcomed home its own with a massive parade. Notably, the soldiers now carried American Springfield rifles, their Mosin Nagants left behind forever, bringing them home. The expedition left unfinished business. Over 100 American soldiers remained buried in Russian soil. For 10 years, polar bear veterans lobbied for a mission to recover their comrades. Finally, in 1929, a joint expedition, including veterans and Army Graves registration personnel, returned to Russia. The recovery teams faced heartbreaking conditions. Wooden crosses had rotted, graves had been disturbed, and identification often relied on uniform buttons or personal effects. Working through swamps and forests with old campaign maps, they recovered 86 sets of remains before winter forced their departure. On Memorial Day 1930, 56 recovered soldiers were interred around the Polar Bear Monument in Troy, Michigan. Among them were Lieutenants Ralph Powers and Francis Cuff, heroes of Visokaya Gora and Ust-Padenga. Additional recoveries in 1934 brought more men home, though approximately 30 Americans still rest in Russian soil. Legacy of the Polar Bears. The North Russia expedition's statistics tell a grim story. 583 total casualties, including 109 combat deaths from a force of fewer than 5,000 men. These losses, proportionally higher than many Western Front units, came in a war most Americans never knew was being fought. The expedition failed in every strategic objective. The Bolsheviks retained power, Allied supplies fell into red hands, and American involvement possibly strengthened Soviet propaganda about capitalist aggression. Yet the individual soldiers performed magnificently under impossible conditions, maintaining discipline and humanity in a bewildering conflict. The 339th Infantry's regimental crest bears a polar bear and the Russian motto, "The bayonet decides." But what did their bayonets decide in the frozen forests of North Russia? Perhaps only this: that American soldiers, thrown into an impossible situation by unclear policy and international politics, would do their duty with courage and determination. Today, the polar bears remain largely forgotten, their sacrifice overshadowed by the Great War's Western Front. Yet their story deserves remembrance, not as a glorious campaign, but as a cautionary tale about the costs of unclear objectives and mission creep. In the villages along the Dvina and Vaga rivers, in places with names Americans could barely pronounce, citizen soldiers from Detroit fought and died in temperatures that froze rifle bolts and turned wounds fatal in minutes. They went to Russia to guard supplies and ended up fighting a war. They were promised a quick deployment and stayed 13 months. They were told they were making the world safe for democracy, and found themselves killing and dying in someone else's civil war. The polar bear's experience in North Russia stands as a testament to soldier endurance and a warning about the dangers of military intervention without clear purpose or achievable ends. The last word belongs to the soldiers themselves. As one veteran wrote, "We were the polar bears, and we did our duty. But God help the nation that sends its sons to fight in wars it doesn't understand for causes it can't explain."